Double V for victory, victory over racism, and victory over fascism. Chapter 18. In the 1930s, the United States is still in the midst of the Great Depression. The population is not only having financial problems, but race problems as well. And it doesn't really matter what color your skin is, you are affected by the Depression. We don't want to hear about the problems other countries are having. We don't want to listen to the warnings from people in the know. We're still kind of angry over being tricked into getting into the war before, going overseas in 1917. After all, there had been a commission report that the atrocities being committed by the Germans, that report had been false. It was the war merchants in their attempt to make money. They had duped we Americans, and we were not going to let it happen again. So any politician who wanted to be reelected or stay elected would never mention the growth of fascism in Europe or the military takeover on faraway Asian or African places. Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his speech to the nation, January the 6th, 1941, he was talking about 4 freedoms. He said, in the future days, which we will seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression, everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means an economic understanding which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants, everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation might be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. In Japan, and this is a picture on the left of Emperor Hirohito, the country needed raw materials. It's a beautiful nation, but it's so full of mountains and so many little separate islands that they have no raw materials. So they overran Manchuria, the industrial area of China. Well, of course, we didn't like it. And we sent messages of protest. The picture on the right is just a picture of a Japanese family. We mustn't forget that they too were human, although some of the stories we heard will lead us to believe otherwise. Meanwhile, in Italy, a World War I veteran who had ambitions and knew how to manipulate the press began his rise in power. His base was the working poor, and taking advantages of the political, social, and economic crisis in Italy, Benito Mussolini, he threatened to make Italy ungovernable through massive violence unless he was promoted to prime minister. And once in that position in 1922, he systematically took over control of every facet of the Italian people's lives. All they wanted was strength and security. They still hadn't gotten over the emotional upheaval of World War I. He used propaganda to build himself up as a legend who was always right and could solve all of Italy's problems. And anyone who didn't feel that way or disagreed with him, he simply had them killed. He was extremely nationalistic, and his dream was to make the Mediterranean Sea a Mare Nostrum again, of our sea, as the ancient Romans called it. And wanting to become an imperialistic nation like the rest of Europe, he sent his army to invade the country of Ethiopia. Now, this is a map of Africa, and here is Ethiopia right here. Here's Italy way up here, Ethiopia. And there were letters of protest sent again from not only the African nations in Europe, but from us also. Paper threats. Meanwhile, the black community here in America protested loudly and longly. It was a defeat of blacks by whites. So monies were contributed by the African and nation peoples to aid the different agencies. Another veteran of World War I, Adolf Hitler, He'd come to power in a rather roundabout way in Germany, and in 1929, his new political party, the Nazis, he did not start the Nazi Party, he merely reformed the party. He began his political move, and Germany was in the midst of a depression, and they'd never gotten over their shame they felt at the loss of the war. The opinion of the general public was that they had been betrayed. They hadn't really lost the war. And Hitler, playing on nationalistic pride and with someone else to blame other than ourselves, he began a very slow rise. He began his base with the poor workers out in the fields, then in the small towns, and in the cities, then to the factory owners and workers. A slow, steady climb. And in the elections of 1932, major elections were held in Germany, and the Nazi Party took 38% of the vote. Now, that wasn't enough to take control, but it was enough to keep any other party from taking control. Excuse me. So the leaders of the other party, of which there were many, they thought, well, Hitler's a young man new to politics. Well, maybe we'll offer him a cabinet post in exchange for his party's support so we can form a government. Well, Hitler refused. He said, no, the only way I will give you my party's support is if you make me Chancellor, which is Prime Minister. And when he got that position, he played it cool. That is until the country's beloved President Paul von Hindenburg died. He then systematically used Germany's own laws to dismantle the government and make himself dictator and begin his reign of terror. First thing he did was withdraw from the League of Nations, and then he began to rearm, which was against the treaty that they had signed. And since this is not an American history class, we won't spend any more time on his actions except that one. The thing he wanted most was the nations of the world to respect him in Germany. And one way, according to his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, was of the international propaganda that could be used in Germany over the 1936 Olympic Games. Well, you might think, how did he manage to come up with that? But actually, the Olympic Games are awarded something like 10 or 15 years ahead of time. So Berlin got the Games long before Hitler was ever on the scene. The Nazis began their Nazification of all aspects of German life, and of course that included sports. It was part of his overall plan to show the world that the Aryan race, the German people, the blue-eyed blondes, were superior and should rule the world. And the Olympics were his first step. Now, there was a lot of concern for the safety of black athletes if they were to go to the Olympics from our country. And black journalists were writing of the hypocrisy of those who did not first address the problem of discrimination against black athletes in the United States. But there were those for going, and they argued that athletic victories by blacks would help undermine the Nazi racial views of the Aryan supremacy and give a new sense of black pride in the United States. In the end, 18 Africans, 16 men, 2 women, went to Berlin. One problem. All the athletes came from predominantly white universities. And of course, this just demonstrated that, especially to the black journalists, that the inferiority of training and the equipment in the all-black colleges, which is where the vast majority of African-American students were educated. But it was at this Olympics, the 1936 Olympics, that the tradition began of a lone runner bringing into the stadium, bringing the Olympic torch, and having carried it from the relay site of the ancient games in Olympic Greece. But of the 18 black athletes, 14 won medals, and they dominated the track and field events. American journalists are hailing the victories of a young black Jesse Owens, winner of the 100 and 200 meter dash, with gold, the broad jump with gold, and the 4x100 meter relay with gold, as well as the other blacks. And it was a blow to the Nazi myth of Aryan supremacy. And the picture on the right, of course, is Jesse standing with saluting the American flag as place one, and the one on the far right, of course, is a German with Heil Hitler. The irony is, with all the publicity and American pride, when the athletes did return home, they faced social and economic discrimination just as before. But back in Berlin, Hitler stated he would not shake the hand of any non-Aryan, which of course included the American blacks. He would advise to either shake everyone's hand or no one's hand. He chose the latter. Goebbels called the black victories a disgrace, but American blacks were proud. And for 2 weeks of the games, everything was fine. The Germans attempted to camouflage the racist, militaristic character of their country. The anti-Jewish signs had been taken down. All the undesirables had been rounded up and put in camps. And everyone made nice. But as soon as the games were over, Germany's expansionist racial policies accelerated. By the way, Jesse Owens was born in 1913 in Alabama, the son of an Alabama sharecropper. And he was attending the predominantly white Ohio State University when he went to the Olympics. After graduation, he went into community service and he worked with youth and traveling widely. He gave speeches. And his speeches always supported clean living, fair play, and patriotism. He truly believed that the athletic competition could help solve racial and political black problems. But here in the old US of A, and this is what the Hitler said, the Americans should be ashamed of themselves letting Negroes win their medals for them. I shall not shake hands with this Negro. Do you really think I will allow myself to be photographed shaking hands with a Negro? This is supposed to be a quote from Hitler. Joe Louis, the black boxer who was on the other side of an Alabama sharecropper, was making headlines. In 1935, he defeated the former heavyweight champion Primo Camara, which was a friend and protege of Benito Mussolini. And because of this, he was called Little Ethiopia, the reference of Mussolini taking over the country. He became the first black to hold the heavyweight championship in 22 years when he defeated James Braddock in 1937. He was accepted by the white masses because he was humble, and he avoided any of what could be called provocative behavior, like the previous black champion Jack Johnson, who had antagonized white America by not knowing his place and playing around with white women. Unfortunately, when Joe met Max Schmeling, the German boxer, in 1935, he lost. Schmeling had ended his celebration by shouting, "Heil Hitler!" And to say the black community went into mourning would be an understatement. They met again in 1938, and this time, as the fight began, the crowd began to shout, "Back to Hitler." Nevertheless, Joe Louis did win that fight, and he reigned as heavyweight champion of the world from 1937 to 1949 and became a hero to the black public. And his decision to cooperate with and become a symbol of the white government that was not fair to him and his people, although it seems strange to us today, it did help race relations. If you ever get a chance to read his life story, do it. He was a good man. He was a humble, simple man, an altogether giving man, and he wound up totally broke and owing everybody before he died. He gave away most of his stuff, and he got gypped out of the rest of it. And fascism simply is an authoritative and nationalistic right wing of politics. It's government controls everything, from how you make the money to how you spend the money to the books you read and everything. But it encourages private ownership of capital, because it takes money to get things done, and the more money you make, the more it can tax. So in Italy, we have a fascist government run by Mussolini. In Germany, we have a fascist government run by Hitler, and it's called the Nazi Party. In Japan, we have a very militaristic government headed by a General Tito, a military man who's a prime minister, although we do have an emperor. He is strictly a, well, what's the word I'm looking for? He doesn't have any power per se. He's just like Queen Elizabeth. He's there. And all three, Mussolini, Hitler, and Tito, are systematically destroying what they consider their enemies. All three seem to be unstoppable. And of course, each time a threatening move against another country was made, condemnation letters were sent. Paper threats. You see, we Americans were way too busy trying to end our depression to be concerned with anything that was going on elsewhere, and we weren't going to be tricked into going overseas again. 1938, Hitler invaded Poland, and the world was at it again. We, of course, the first thing we did was declare neutrality. Sound familiar? Like a repeat of World War I? The Germans unleashed a new type of warfare called the Blitzkrieg. The Blitzkrieg is a German word. It's strictly two German words put together. The word blitz simply means lightning. The word Krieg, Krieg, means war. So we have the Blitzkrieg, which was lightning war. They moved in fast. And Germany quickly took over Denmark and Norway, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and then Berlin. In June of 1940, the city of Paris stood silent as the war machine of Germany marched smartly into her city with their little goose steps and their shiny bells on their hats. There were no riots. There was no demonstrations. There was no tire burnings. The upheavals that Paris was noted for, nothing. Even the Germans were surprised. And we have some pictures of the French people standing alongside the street, but it's predominantly old and wounded soldiers and children and women. You don't see any young people. And they're crying. There's tears running down their cheeks. As I said, the Germans were surprised too because they had expected some kind of resistance. See, the French were still in shock from World War I. They had not recovered an entire generation of men dead. They did not want their beautiful city destroyed, and this is what they had threatened to do, to destroy totally Paris. So surrender. Okay, what's next? England? By the end of the summer of 1940, our leaders in Washington knew what was going to happen next. But what could they do? Our officials were elected, and the American public would never hear of us getting involved. But then there was talk about that big, beautiful Atlantic Ocean. What would happen if Germany took over England? Would the Atlantic become a German lake? A big pond on the pathway to the Americas? Well, thankfully, our government, without making a big public fuss, slowly began to prepare for what they knew was going to happen. Now, there's one thing you've got to realize. Our nation, our general public, they had this fear of a standing army that we've had since the Revolutionary War. It didn't matter what color they were. They just didn't want an armed standing army, and they especially didn't want an armed black man. And in 1940, there were less than 4,000 African Americans in the army, of some 230,000. And they still had less than a dozen black officers. So in 1940, the Selective Service Act was passed. And it did forbid the discrimination in the draft and the training of men, but we know it was bound to happen. And as soon as the blacks realized it, they began to protest. The black leaders, such as A. Philip Randolph and Walter White, wrote a 7-point program and presented it to FDR. They concerned the recruitment and training of black men, and they wanted them integrated. Well, so much for words on paper. It became clear very soon that although black men were being brought into the service, they were put into segregated units. And these units would be strictly backup. They do maintenance and construction and that type of thing. And as the country began to go into a wartime footing, the same problems that had been apparent in World War I began to show themselves. Discrimination in jobs, discrimination in houses. They were not allowed to work in plants that had defense contracts, even though the president spoke out against this policy. Wages rose in defense plants, but no blacks benefit. So Mr. Randolph came up with the idea, who happened to be the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids. He says, let's have a march on Washington. Demand that the government do something to help the blacks get jobs. Well, Mayor LaGuardia of New York did everything he could to prevent the march from taking place, and even Mrs. Roosevelt was in agreement. The march would do no good, it would do harm. And with matters of pressure, even from the top, no one could dissuade Randolph from the march unless a deal was reached. And a deal was reached. Executive Order 8808 was issued, which stated that there should be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries of government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. And it is a duty of employers and of labor organizations to provide for the full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries without discrimination because of race, creed, color, or national origin. And that clause was placed in all government contracts. And a Fair Employment Practices Committee was organized to take care of the complaints. Well, the white Southerners a lot of white employers, they did not like this fair employment practices. They didn't like this statement. For instance, Mark Etheridge, a Louisville, Kentucky newspaperman and an original member of the committee, said that the order was not a social document and it did not concern racial integration or segregation. He did add significantly, all the armies of the world, both of the United Nations and the Axis, could not force upon the South the abandonment of racial segregation. A white Alabama lawyer was so furious that he organized something called a League to Maintain White Supremacy, while the governor of that state declared that he would refuse to sign a contract that would force him to abandon a policy of segregation that he regarded as essential to racial peace. Now here we're being known, according to our president, that we're the arsenal of democracy, providing support to our allies by lending, giving, and other ways around our supposed policy of neutrality. And the entire time we're trying to make the world safe from evil, we're fighting at home to maintain our discriminatory policies based on the color of one's skin. We definitely were not practicing what we were preaching. The African Americans saw, of course, it was the most significant document since the Emancipation Proclamation, but we know better. By the end of 1940, France had fallen to Hitler's forces. In Germany, Italy, and Japan had formed an alliance. Within a year, Japan had moved into China and Southeast Asia. The United States imposed sanctions on Japan, but these failed to restrain Japan's expansion. And on Sunday morning, December the 7th, 1941, Japan attacked the American forces stationed at Pearl Harbor and other U.S. military facilities on Oahu and the Hawaiian Islands. A black mess attendant aboard the USS West Virginia, whose name was Dory Miller, was among those later cited for distinction during this battle. But in the heat of the battle, he pulled his wounded captain to safety, and although he had never fired a machine gun before, Dory Miller shot down as many as 4 attacking planes, for which he later received the Navy Cross for heroism. Now, when the war began in Europe back in 1937, there was only about 5,000 black enlisted men and fewer than a dozen black officers in the regular army. But before the war ended in 1945, more than 1 million black men and women had served in the armed forces, and nearly half of them served abroad, most in Europe and North Africa. But thousands also served in the Pacific. Now, African Americans served in all branches of the military during the war. And of that 1 million plus black, they included at long last black nurses because they discriminated against those for a long, long time. (1941), I'm sorry. It should be 42. 1942, blacks were finally allowed to join the Marines. In 43, the Navy allowed 16 African Americans to enter officer training. And they really expected them all to fail, or maybe only 1 or 2 passed. But guess what? All 16 passed. And 12 of them actually did receive commissions. A 13 was commissioned to warrant officer, which is kind of that in-between space between an enlisted man and an officer. The rest were sent back to the units with no explanation. But by the war's end, all branches had allowed integrated officer training except the Air Corps. We have men serving in the Coast Guard. We have men serving in the Merchant Marines. Some served in combat, field artillery, engineering, and tanks. And of course, there was the scud jobs. In 1945, there was a combat unit that was actually integrated. It worked extremely well, and it proved that the black and the white could fight together. Oh, sure, there were some problems, but most of them could be traced directly to the fact that the black men, for the most part, were not as educated as the white troops, nor had as good a training. At the end of the 6 months, the experiment was ended. Why? Well, for one reason, the war was bad over in Europe, and during peacetime, we really don't need to mix blacks and whites. No official reason was ever given. Now, going into the battles, we talked last week. You learned about the war and some of the battles. You learned about the Tuskegee Airmen and some of the problems. So we're not going to get that much into it, but we will talk a little bit about problems. the African Americans supported the war with their bodies and their finances. They bought bonds, and we had so many bond selling campaigns. I mean, people from Hollywood were selling bonds, and it was just all over the place. And they were very active in the Office of Civilian Defense. They worked as block managers and attorneys in economics. They served in the Red Cross, the women did. There were ray ladies, there were nurses' aides, there were drivers of trucks. And the whole time, we've got more blacks migrating to the cities where they've got the defense plants. But you got the same old stuff. You've got discrimination, you've got segregation, and black men in uniform and out could and often were refused service. And for instance, there was 3 female black WACs that happened to be in Kentucky that were beaten by white policemen because they didn't move fast enough. And another one in our beloved state of South Carolina, where a white policeman gouged a black soldier's eyes out. Black newspapers were taken from the black soldiers and burned. They were forced to wait until all the white soldiers had loaded on buses before they could board. They were segregated in the post exchanges, and then when they were waited on, they were sold inferior merchandise. And of course, all accommodations were inferior, and they were laying down their lives for us. And when the War Department demands that discrimination against African American soldiers would not be tolerated, of course, certain areas of the South, as we've already mentioned, made known they would never comply. And then, too, there were some who, the base commanders who were white, would not enforce the rule of not segregation. So there would be clashes. It's not unexpected. When the black man demanded what should have been his by right, which was equal treatment, no way. For instance, when black officers were arrested for attempting to enter a white officers club, and black servicemen would be charged with mutiny because they refused to perform work that had been assigned to them only because they were black. And it can be understood why the morale was at an all-time low for the black soldier. The 4 freedoms that we were fighting for seemed to apply only to white people. But we've got some bad problems. Like I said, you've got all these people moving to the defense plants. 50,000 Americans, 450,000 whites. They moved up to the north and to the west in between 40 and 43. And of course, there's a lack of housing. There's competition for jobs. You have race baiters. You got the government's new rules. The ingredients are all there. In June the 20th, 1943, a fist fight broke out between a black man and a white man. And that was kind of the lighting the fuse. Rumors spread, and within a few hours, fighting was going on throughout Detroit. Whites began doing the type of thing that were done in the South. They burned black cars. They beat any black men they came across. The government was slow to come out help, and it really was a two-way street. It got to be a real race riot. The video I'm showing you all explains it a little bit better, and it's one of about a 5-part series, but this particular segment you're going to see just a few minutes long, and it shows you some other graphic pictures of things that were going on. The white people couldn't go into the black area without getting killed. The black people couldn't go into the white area without getting killed. It didn't matter who you were or what you were. If you were in the wrong place and you had the wrong color skin, you could be killed. As I said, the governor was slow in calling out help, and it took a call from FDR and a proclamation of a state emergency and 6,000 soldiers to patrol the city to bring about control and peace. 30 hours of rioting. 25 African Americans and 9 whites were killed, and hundreds of thousands of dollars of property damage was done. In order to prevent a riot in the city, other large cities started making some efforts to quell any racial tensions, but the blacks kept protesting for equal jobs and housing. They protested at the policy of the Red Cross separating blood, black man's blood and white man's blood. And of course, reminding the white population that it was a black doctor, Dr. Charles Drew, that had not only discovered how to preserve blood, but organized the world's first blood bank drive, nicknamed Blood for Britain. Now, Charles Drew was a very well-educated man, honor student when he was going to college. He specialized in anatomy. He began researching blood plasma and transfusions in New York City, and then he made his discoveries relating to the preservation of blood. By separating the liquid red blood cells from the near solid plasma and freezing the two separately, he found that it could be preserved and reconstituted at a later date. His system for storing the blood plasma revolutionized the medicine area, and like I said, he also established the first American Red Cross blood bank. He had a title called the medical director of the first plasma division for blood transfusion, supplying blood. The British military used his process extensively during the war. They established mobile blood banks to aid the treatment of wounded soldiers on the front lines. The American Red Cross decided to set up blood donor stations to collect plasma for the U.S. Army, but of course it was kept separate, white blood from black blood. Charles Drew had a car wreck when he was 46 in North Carolina, and although it's never been proven, he bled to death because they couldn't get him to the hospital in time, and it's been proven that there was a white hospital close by, but they would not accept him. An experienced black newspaperman was hired to be an advisor in the race relations for the Office of the War Information Department, of the OWI. And he was responsible for getting information to the black community on what the black troops were accomplishing. But the OWI also hired black artists and photographers. They distributed more than 2 million pamphlets titled Negroes in the War, containing not only pictures but articles on the black personnel to supposedly help black morale. But some black leaders thought it was a slap in the face for the black man. And one of them said it was a monumental mistake and a disservice to the government of the Negro. I say this because it's like kicking a man who is down and then congratulating him because he's not yet dead. But the War Department also hired black war correspondents. And this was supposed to, report on the good things that the black men were doing, but the reporters wrote of what was really going on. There were the racial tensions and the treatment of the black serviceman. And that did not improve morale. But the visits by leading African Americans from different organizations and the AME Church did help. Eleanor Roosevelt actually said, "The nation cannot expect the colored people to feel that the U.S. is worth defending if the Negro continues to be treated as he is now." And yet they continued to fight for freedoms abroad, freedoms they were denied at home. Only now they begin to look at the World Organization to help them solve the problems at home. After the war, African Americans were interested in world affairs, and I know it seems strange when there's so much going on here, but they voiced their opinions loudly when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, and the next year in 1936, when the Spanish Civil War broke out, they voiced their feelings and took up money. So I guess it's not without surprise that at the end of the war, they would call for a peace based on justice and with no regard to color. Something called the United Nations was established in 1945. But before we get to that, let's back up just a minute and talk about these black soldiers receiving praise from the white commanding officers. They received praise from the Secretary of War and the Chief of Staff. Their heroism was never questioned, even at the highest levels, but why had no black men received the Medal of Honor? The blacks did receive medals, the Distinguished Service Cross from America, the Navy Cross from America, the Distinguished Flying Cross from America, and from the French, the Croix de Guerre, from the Yugoslavian government, the Partisan Medal, and from the Soviet Union, the Heroism Medal. They had received medals, but no Medal of Honor. Well, was it a white man's medal? There was an investigation in the 1990s because there had been so many complaints about it, but they came up with the conclusion that racism was a cause. Surprise. Okay, now I just got a little bit ahead of myself. The United Nations was established in 1945. But even though the war is over, FDR had just died, and he'd been elected president for 4 terms. And the black community really thought that he and his wife had done more than anyone else or any other president since Lincoln to help them. So a big conference was held in San Francisco, and some of the people who were attending were Mary McLeod Bethune of the National Council of Negro Women, W.E.B. Du Bois, still in the States, Walter White of the NAACP, a lot of black reporters, and there were delegates from India and Liberia and Ethiopia and Haiti, and from Holland and Belgium and even South America. And by the way, the ones from Holland, Belgium, and South America were not received by the black nations with any great deal of love, because these are the nations that originally had the colonial period. Now, anytime you have a large delegation of foreign countries trying to settle issues, it can be a little bit confusing. You have different cultures, you've got different languages, and the problems of translating what was said could be a problem, because a wrong word could cause an international incident. But the proposed charter, well, it paid a lot of attention to the rights of human beings. And I love the preamble. It states, quote, faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. It's beautiful. One of the agencies it set up was the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which you probably know as UNICEF. And their job was to set up a worldwide program of education. Very laudable ambition. But unfortunately, our American blacks put too much faith in that organization, because they had hoped it would lead to a program for African Americans in the U.S., as well as a program for the Europeans. Not going to happen. Eleanor Roosevelt, meanwhile, was appointed to the Commission of Human Rights, and she served admirably. But African Americans hoped that the UN would be able to help end discrimination in America. Very naive. When the UN began to consider problems in India and South America, they had more hope. In 1946, the National Negro Congress filed a petition on behalf of African Americans to the UN to aid in our country the elimination of discrimination. Well, our government has always rejected any interference from any outside source on any problem in our country. We'd even failed to sign that treaty ending World War I because of the League of Nations clause in it. And the thought of the United Nations getting involved in what we considered a domestic matter, it ain't going to happen, baby. The Voice of America was a way for freedom's loving nations to broadcast to the communist nations what was going on in the free world. Well, that sounds good, but one of the news items chosen to be broadcast was the news of a lynching of a South Carolina black man, with all the gory details. So London and Moscow and Paris all heard our dirty linen being broadcast. And it didn't make us look good. To some, communism began to look like a better alternative than what was happening to the blacks in the South of America. But even with all the problems, there were opportunities for service in the UN for African Americans. Ralph Boucher won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950 for his work in helping mediate a Palestinian dispute. And there was always a black face represented in our delegations, and African Americans worked in many of the areas of the United Nations. But with a delegation from Africa at the UN, there was an increase of interest in the UN by the American blacks. And the delegation from Africa were reminders of the possibilities for the African American. And that combined with the new policies in the U.S. to try to improve race relations. Not because they were right or fair, but we had to compete with the growing communist bloc. Small steps, small steps. Now, the war has been particularly, well, it's not pleasant. I mean, we've always heard of it, that it was a good war and yada yada, but when you have people dying right and left, it's not good. As a matter of course, the result of the end of segregation was ordered in 1948 by Harry Truman with Executive Order 9981, and the services were integrated. The Tuskegee Airmen, which you learned about last lesson, they really admired someone called Bessie Coleman. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Bessie. Bessie's quite a feisty little girl. She's also a very attractive young woman. And she's known to say the air is the only place free from prejudice. Well, Bessie was born in Atlanta, Texas. the 10th of 13 children. Her father was a three-quarter Choctaw Indian, and her parents were sharecroppers. Yet it seems that she had a happy childhood. She spent playing in the front yard on the porch, and Sunday mornings and afternoons, of course, were spent at church. And as the other children began to age and find work in the field, Bessie assumed responsibilities around the house. She helped look after her younger sisters and helped her mother, who worked in the garden, and she performed a lot of the everyday chores of running the house. And this is before she was 6, because when she got to be 6, she'd walk 4 miles, 2 one way and 2 back, to an all-black one-room school. She didn't always have chalk or pencils, but she was an excellent student, and she loved to read, and it didn't take long before she became a very outstanding reading and math student. She went to all 8 grades in that one-room schoolhouse. But her routine of school and chores and church were interrupted, of course, by the cotton harvest, and because each man, woman, and child was needed to pick cotton, and the whole family worked together in the fields during the harvest time. In 1901, when she was 9 years old, I guess you'd say her life took a dramatic turn because her daddy left. He'd become fed up with the racial barriers in Texas, so he went back to Oklahoma, or Indian Territory it was called. He wanted to find better opportunities. But his wife Susan and the children, they did not go with him. And at the age of 12, Bessie was accepted into the Missionary Baptist Church, where when she turned 18, she took all of her savings and she enrolled in the Oklahoma Colored Agricultural and Normal University in Langston, Oklahoma. But she was only able to complete 1 term before she ran out of money and was forced to return home. In 1915, at the age of 23, she decided to leave town, and she went all the way to Chicago to live with her brothers and find a job. And while she was there, she worked in a supermarket, and she also worked at a barbershop as a manicurist. And she started hearing tales of the war from pilots who were returning home and from World War I, and they told stories about flying in the war, and she started to fantasize about being a pilot. And her brother used to tease her by commenting that French women were better than African American women because French women were pilots already. Well, she came across some rather influential men at the barber shop, and one was the founder and publisher of a paper in Chicago. And there was also a real estate promoter, and we don't know how friendly they became, but we do know that she did get financial backing from them, and from both of them, who they liked her. They said that she had a very flamboyant personality, and she was also very pretty. And they promoted her in the newspaper and wanted her to go to France to learn how to fly. So she took French lessons in Chicago, then she traveled to Paris in 1920. She couldn't get admission to the American flight schools because she was black and a woman. And even over there, she was the only non-white student at the French school, and she learned while using a plane that she had several ups and downs, but, she finally got it through. September of 1921, she comes back to the United States, and she causes a media sensation. She was admired by both blacks and whites, and a year later, she participated in her first air show in Long Island. And she continued to perform in air shows. And she had several crashes, but she still broke her leg and her rib a couple of times, and when her plane stalled one time. But she was becoming very notorious, and she was determined to make it. On April the 30th, 1926, Coleman had just recently purchased a plane in Dallas, and had just come in from Jacksonville in preparation for a new air show. Well, her friends and family, they didn't think the aircraft was safe, and they asked her not to fly it. But she takes it up with her mechanic, Mr. William Wills. He was flying pilot, by the way. And Coleman, she didn't put on her seatbelt because she was planning a parachute jump the next day, and she wanted to look over the cockpit and examine the area below. About 12 minutes into the flight, the plane did not go out of a planned nosedive. Instead, it accelerated into a tailspin. Bessie Coleman was thrown from the plane at 500 feet and died instantly when she hit the ground. Mr. Willis was unable to gain control of the plane, and it plunged to the ground, and he died upon impact, and the plane burst into flames. But despite the badly burned plane, an investigation revealed that the crash was probably due to a wrench that was lodged in the control gears. So a misplaced tool caused 2 people to die. At her funeral, more than 10,000 people showed up. One of them was Ida B. Wells, a lot of prominent members from the Black Society. Bessie Coleman was the first African-American woman pilot, and she's been honored in several ways since her death. There's a group of black male pilots that fly every year over her grave. And in 1977, there was a group of African-American women pilots who established the Bessie Coleman Aviators Club. In 1995, she was honored with her image on a postage stamp. But Bessie Coleman was quite a gal, and the Tuskegee Airmen really did admire her. They said they were continuing on the path that she had forged. Now I want to mention one more thing before we end, something else that's not in the text. Did you ever hear of a place called Port Chicago? Now, Port Chicago is 30 miles north of San Francisco, and it was a munitions factory in 1944. Now, where is my information on that? I love it when I misplace stuff. There's a lot of conspiracies about it. It grew from nothing. At this point in time, the officers and the senior enlisted men were all white, and all the loaders were, of course, black. They did the scut work, remember? When I've got a YouTube and I want you to see it, it does a pretty good job of explaining what happened and why it happened. They say it was probably because of bad training and the fact that there was always competition between the different crews to try to improve and see who could get the most loaded. And on July the 17th, 1944, there was a humongous explosion. And this is what the dock looked like afterward. I mean, the ship they were loading is gone, totally disintegrated. There's a hole in the ground, and miles away, the little city of Port Chicago, it's just practically devastated. Every wind in the house, every wind in the town is gone. And there was an investigation. And it was decided that it was because of not enough training that the accident happened, that they were going to set some new rules. But the men who were there, okay, I found it. There was 4,600 tons of explosion. 400 tons of explosives were nearby on rail cars, and 320 workers were on the pier. At 10:18, a series of massive explosions over several seconds destroyed everything and everyone in the vicinity. Blasts were felt as far away as Nevada. Some damage extended as far as San Francisco, and every building in Port Chicago was damaged, and people were literally knocked off their feet. The pilot of one plane flying at 9,000 feet in the area claimed that metal chunks from the explosion flew past him. Now, nearly 2/3 of the people killed at Port Chicago were African-American enlisted men in the Navy, which was 15% of all African-Americans killed during World War II. The men who were surviving and had helped put out the fires and saw the horrors firsthand were reassigned to something called Mare Island. Less than 30 days later, they were ordered to load more munitions. But they still had received no training. They'd received no consolation over the post-traumatic stress. They'd been, they'd just been sent to this one place, and that was it. And 258 said no. Well, 208 of them were then sentenced to bad conduct discharges and pay forfeiture and kicked out of the military. The remaining 50 men were considered ringleaders and were put on trial for general court-martial. And they were sentenced to between 8 and 15 years of hard labor. Although in all honesty, 2 years later, they were all given clemency. But as late as 1994, a review of the trials revealed that, guess what? Race had played a factor in the harsh sentences. In December of 1999, President Bill Clinton pardoned Freddie Meeks, one of only 3 of the 50 convicted sailors known to still be alive. The Port Chicago disaster eventually led to the implementation of safer procedures for loading ammunition. It put greater emphasis on the proper training of people doing the loading and the munitions themselves were altered to give greater safety. And there is even a national memorial to the victims on the site where it happened. But there are rumors. And there have been people who've taken measurements, and they've decided that that explosion was too big. It could not have happened from just that small amount of ammunition. The current theory, although not proven, is that it was an atomic bomb explosion, that they were in the process of loading an atomic bomb and they were going to take it out in the islands and test it. Well, of course, none of us knew about the atomic bomb at this point in time. It would be another year before we've even heard about it. Some of the theories I read make sense. Some of them I'm thinking, I don't know, that, you got awful lot of explosion there. You got depth charges, you've got bullets, you've got hand grenades, you've got big guns. I don't know. Is it possible that there was an atomic bomb on there? Well, they did find traces of some radiation, but it's been proven it could have come from another source. We'll never know for sure. But the reason I'm telling you about it is the fact that it demonstrates the segregation in the military, that the blacks were doing the hard work, and most of the people killed were African Americans. Watch the YouTube all the way through. It's only, I think it's about 10 minutes. It alternates between telling you the story and showing you pictures and talking to a man who was one of the naval personnel assigned to load and unload, and he was scheduled to go to work an hour after the explosion happened. I think you'll find it unusual. But war makes strange headlines and strange bedfellows even worse than politics.